Malta is for some reason at the center of all of this stuff. And I, honestly, as I was going through all of this information, I couldn't figure out why. Hitler must have lost something like 128 planes to obtain this tiny little island, both for strategy and what would seem like some type of metaphysical madness that he had.
So, that's the funny thing with the idea of Atlantis, to me at least. Why argue about that? Why even bring it up? It's like, talk about the stuff that's been found, because that's mind-blowing. It's just, Malta is just one of those places that if it wasn't on my bucket list, it's on that now.
If you control Malta, do you control the world? Why did Hitler and conquerors in history desperately want the tiny island? Ancestral history that goes back to the time of Odysseus may actually go back even farther, so you're not going to want to miss this. Today, you'll hear John Vivanco's remote viewing data on the massive civilization of Atlantis. You'll hear my investigative research on the Ottoman Empire's history, the tradition of the Maltese falcon, the Knights of Malta, and my theories about Calypso. Have you ever thought about the water levels during the last ice age and what it means for modern archaeology's historical research? Well, you will soon. Join John and me, Rob Counts, for a metaphysical show that's out of this world.
Are you listening to the Metaphysical Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or anywhere else? Leave us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us when you do that. Reach tons of people when you do this. And remember, you've got to like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Ganjing World, Twitter, and Facebook.
John, how you doing?
What's going on?
I think there's a lot going on Malta.
We got some stuff here. We got some stuff.
Yeah. I feel like usually we'll kind of conduct a series on something and I'm like, it's not going to get crazier than this. And then you stumble upon something like Malta and it does. It goes to that next level.
Right. Yeah. And I don't think, Malta is talked about, but it's sort of, there are other things that sort of take precedence when people talk about ancient civilizations. It seems like to me, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I didn't ever really expect Malta to be this extensive, expansive, and strange. Yeah, dense.
It's dense with rich ancient civilization, temples, and lore.
I mean, when you get into it and you start rolling this out, I think people's minds are going to be blown just based off of the denseness of what's been going on there.
Well, and for those of you at home that don't know where Malta is an island basically off the shore of Italy. It's south of Sicily, and it kind of is between Europe and Africa. Okay, and it's very small. And to give you an idea of how small this place is, it is 1/10 of the size of the state of Rhode Island in the United States, which is the United States' smallest state, if you're in Europe and you're not aware of that. This island, in a sense, has no business having 20 plus temples and megalithic sites on it in the middle of the Mediterranean.
It has no business having that stuff, considering if you believe that the world has always looked the way it currently looks. Yeah,
and as this sort of unraveled, I have to tell you this is an unraveling, never-ending rabbit hole that basically takes you eventually to the lands of Sicily and even Sardinia, which we're just don't have time to talk about all of that right now. And so we're going to probably have to do separate series on these areas that are way older than people are telling us. And if you want to know how old it is, in Homer's Odyssey, Malta seems to have also been referenced. Experts believe that the island of Ogygia was referring to the island of Gozo on Malta. Now, Malta is comprised of two islands, the larger one, and then Gozo, which is just north of Malta. And the Odyssey, you know, we'll get into this a little bit because this episode is all going to be about the historical richness of Malta and what sort of makes it special. Because even on a socio-political scale, Malta is a very strange place. I mean, we're talking about it being referenced in the Odyssey. We're talking about St. Paul getting shipwrecked on Malta, the Ottomans siege of Malta, World War II, Napoleon. I mean, Malta is for some reason at the center of all of this stuff. And I honestly, as I was going through all of this information, I couldn't figure out why. I mean, I understand why strategically and stuff, but it's just this random island, right? So
Yeah,
strange.
yeah, it's strange. We have to think about a little bit about what the potential water levels were a very long time ago. Um, and I know it's going to come up later, but it's like, this type of stuff can't grow there in the state that it's currently in. It never could have. There had to have been another way that subjects, beings, were getting to this location than just it being an island.
And when John
So
says grow, he's not talking about, plants and things. He's talking about the buildings and the craftsmanship and the amount of
exactly.
money that was poured into this place. Also, the fact that Hitler seems to have been obsessed with Malta, which is a big red flag right there. Which we will get into later in this episode. We've got some bangers at the end of this episode for you guys. Let's get into Odysseus because there's a lot of people that don't think Homer's Odyssey was real. And after doing all of the research that I just did, I would disagree with that stance. I think there's too much evidence that has come out of researching the Odyssey that proves to us that the places and the time periods that Homer was talking about in the Odyssey were legit, almost as if he was retelling stories of old in a way that Plato discussed Atlantis, or in the way that J.R.R. Tolkien has discussed Middle Earth and what he was reading reportedly or allegedly in the Oxford libraries in disclosing Norse mythologies. The Odyssey basically follows Odysseus, who is the king of Ithaca, on his journey home after the Trojan War, and what he left back home, which is his wife and his son and his whole kingdom. And they all thought he was dead because it took him so long to get home. Odysseus was the man that came up with the Trojan horse. He was renowned for being a extremely intelligent war strategist. And when they couldn't break into Troy, which they believe they've found in modern day Turkey, he came up with the idea of breaking through their walls in a way that used his wits rather than force, rather than blunt force. And so the Trojan horse got him and his men inside, and he won the war for Greece. And after winning the war, he just has to travel home back to his wife and his son. And this takes, I think, a total of 7 years to get home. And it's just not even that hard of a route to get home, but he just has this amazing adventure along the way. And this is the whole story of Odysseus. Now, one of his stops on his travels is he gets taken prisoner for many years by the Titan, I guess you could say, or the daughter of a Titan named Calypso, who is the goddess of the sea. Calypso is just enamored with Odysseus for whatever reason, and she takes him captive. And this entire scene, I guess you could say, in Odysseus takes place in a cave, right? And what's weird is like every story I'm finding about Malta are always existing in caves underground, right? Because then many years later, you've got St. Paul after the death of Jesus. St. Paul is held captive. He's being taken around by the Romans. They get shipwrecked on Malta, and St. Paul, being who he is, according to the story goes, he, lives a very kind of like humble life. He just lived in caves there. So caves are being referenced in the Odyssey. Caves are being referenced in St. Paul's shipwreck on Malta, right? There's a lot of history here, all having to do with these strange tunnels, which we know are being talked about today. The entire underground of Malta is just a tunnel system.
Yep, that's what it is. It's just holes throughout the whole island. Um, I think that probably most people, even people on the island, don't even understand the extent of the tunnels under that island.
Yeah, and or what was built on top of them,
Right, right.
which
That's absolutely fascinating what's been built on top of them and then claimed to be just 15th century constructions. Really interesting stuff there.
in the 15th century constructions that John is referring to all have to do with the Knights of Malta. And if you want to know a little
Right.
bit more about that, hang on to your hats because we'll be getting
Yeah,
into
we're
it.
going to get into this stuff.
Yeah,
Malta's just one of those places that if it wasn't on my bucket list, it's on that now.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're going there.
Yeah.
100%. Okay, so I have this like after I was doing all of this research, I have this weird theory that I want to share with you, and I want to get your feedback on this. Okay. All right. So I started I started wondering whether or not this character Calypso was real. Because so far, every time they've researched the Odyssey, the account that Homer gives has all basically come to pass as being real in different ways. Now,
Right.
some of it may have been flowery writing so that he could stitch it all together. We're not sure how much of it was Homer being Homer and how much of it was like real historical um, things that had happened. But it looks like the more that this gets researched, the more that it was actually a part of history.
Yeah, honestly, like I think that what he did was he took these various basic events, the big events, the various basic large events, and then he rearranged things, added a little bit here and there, then constructed it into a historical narrative. And I don't think it's exactly 100%, but I think that for the most part it's true.
I agree. I agree with that. Okay, so is a group of islands off the coast of Greece called the Ionian Islands. And what's strange is Ithaca, the place that Homer mentions, is supposed to be this um, made up place that's not real. However, there is an island, a part of the Ionian Islands called Ithaki, which is very similar to Ithaca. So is
Right.
it possible that Odysseus was king of the Ionian Islands?
Oh
And
yeah, I'm sure, right?
right.
It's like Dwarka in India, where Dwarka was the capital. It Right now it's a huge pilgrimage site, and Dwarka exists on land on the coast. But Dwarka in the past existed, well, what we would call further out to sea right now, um, when Krishna ruled it around the time of the Mahabharata War, which is, I don't know,
Hmm.
what is it, like 13, 14,000 years ago, something like that. And they actually have found that underwater now, like this other location where Dwarka was supposed to originally be. So yeah, I absolutely believe that what you're saying is true. Absolutely. These are historical locations that are written off as mythological locations when they're not.
So yeah, was Calypso real? So Calypso was the goddess of the sea and the daughter of the Titan Atlas. We know that the Greek culture flourished from approximately 1200 BC to 323 BC, right? Plato was one of the most credible guys in all of history, and he made a point to produce large amounts of writings about the history of Atlantis. We all know that, right? Okay, all of these stories from Greek culture revolve around champions performing labors like Hercules oftentimes fighting off bizarre things or beings like the Minotaur or the three-headed monster like Cerberus. What if these creatures were leftovers from the Atlantis period, and these labors were to wipe them off the face of the earth, further clearing out that period of history? All right,
They
now,
are, man.
yes.
They
Now,
are.
they were called gods or titans or sons and daughters of, but this could have been like fully charged, genetically superior, or altered beings of an age long past,
They were like
right?
super soldiers from a ancient civilization.
Something like that, right?
Yeah.
And what's also strange is that Gozo, as I was saying, where Odysseus was said to be held captive, is a part of Malta, and Malta has more of the most mysterious megalithic temples in a small area than any other place on Earth, arguably. And so the question is, like, was Malta a part of Atlantis, or was Atlantis limited to a fabled continent in the middle of the Atlantic that Plato recorded had been raised to the ocean by earthquakes? I don't know. What do you guys at home think? That's just a question I'm posing, you know?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, my well, I guess it's based off remote viewing. The civilization way back then was pretty extensive. You could just use Atlantis from a remote viewing perspective as being the mass of civilization across the planet at that time. Because you also had stuff in India, you have stuff in Japan, you have stuff in the Mediterranean, you have stuff in the Atlantic, you have stuff everywhere,
Yeah.
everywhere.
Everywhere.
Yeah. So, and the thing is that nobody's going to actually find Atlantis unless there's like a big marquee when they go scuba diving that says "Welcome to Atlantis." It's just not going to happen. You're not going to really be
Right.
able to say this is Atlantis. And that's funny too, because actually, when you get into the whole social engineering of thought around things by culture, the argument always lies with Atlantis,
Yeah.
right? Why? Why does it lie with Atlantis? Plato wasn't telling the truth; he was using it as an allegory, right? No, look at all of the structures underwater. So that this whole Atlantis thing is to push down the actual evidence that comes to the surface of all these other structures that are underwater. I mean, come on. Because what you're looking at, these structures would have had to have been washed over 12,000 ish years ago when the ocean levels were at least 400 feet lower. So what does that make it? It doesn't make it, cavemen, Neolithic men, whatever, building these sites. It doesn't make it that. It's something else, something deeper, longer, bigger.
Yeah.
So because of the way the stones have been cut. So, that's the funny thing with the idea of Atlantis, to me at least. Why argue about that? Why even like bring it up? It's like talk about the stuff that's been found because that's mind blowing.
Yeah. And uh, it keeps coming back to this for me, which is we're going to have to keep repeating this in every episode just because it just doesn't make sense. But how are our brightest out there in the academic field saying to us with a straight face that modern man could move 50-ton rocks and place them with exact precision the way that they have at all of these sites on Malta as one example, just one example of this. And they're limiting this to people in this thing that they coined called the Stone Age, which makes humans just like they were dumb at that time. And the
Right.
Stone Age, right? It's like, oh, these like little caveman creatures who they're telling us didn't grow much past 4'8", 4'9", 5 feet something. They were able to move 50-ton megalithic rocks the creation of the wheel, before the creation of the wheel,
I think
which
that, yeah.
which wouldn't even like our have there are videos going around on social media showing our best like dump trucks and trucks that move gigantic rocks not being able to move these types of rocks anywhere. Like they
Right.
just basically it's too heavy for them. They can't do it.
Oh yeah,
There's no
exactly. I mean, like architects and engineers have studied the pyramids, Giza, for instance, and they straight out say, "I don't. I think we'd have a very, very difficult time based on the precision and alignment of these structures of building this type of thing today. We just couldn't do it in the way that they
there's no
did it."
way.
Yeah.
There's no way.
I mean, you're talking about engineers and architects who don't have a ball in the game of social engineering. You know,
It can be so easily questioned and made mysterious by an investigative journalist like Graham Hancock or others that have come along that have done the same thing.
we're social animals, and shame arises in us when we're ostracized or we go against whatever social situation we're in. And people strive to avoid shame. So if you're in a system that is literally just putting out nonsense and everybody's following the nonsense, and you're getting something out of it, like money to put food in your mouth, then you're just not going to go against it. You just aren't going to research outside of it. And then you go back to John Wesley Powell and the Powell Doctrine of the Smithsonian in the late 1800s, where it was no, what was it? No, made the decree that no cultures or remnants of a culture should be studied beyond when Columbus discovered America. Basically, that's what it says. So it was like cutting off that vein of research and findings, and then corralling people over the century to stay in one area, don't step outside of it. And that's where we are today.
Yeah, it's weird. It's not even that hard to find this history.
It's not.
So St. Paul gets shipwrecked here.
Which
He
is
gets
weird. I mean, to me, it was like weird that St. Paul comes up.
St. Paul, yeah. It's like but what's so strange is this thread of Malta throughout our civilization just keeps coming up over and over again
Right.
at every turn. You know, the Odyssey, St. Paul, then there's the Ottoman siege of Malta, and which is a very, very interesting conversation. I mean, now the main I guess the capital city of Malta is called Valletta, and it's named after Valette, who was the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta at the time, who was charged with defending Malta and all of Europe from the unbeatable Ottoman Empire. And somehow, a small group, a relatively small group of knights and the men of Malta hold off the Ottoman Empire from entering into Europe and destroying Christendom.
Yeah, that's strange. We're talking about the Knights of Malta here, and we're not talking about the little guys in cars with the little funny hats on with the fez.
No,
No.
no. That and that the Knights of Malta had to basically, I guess you could say, single-handedly saved Europe, and it just gave it this energy to everyone over in Europe to be able to fight off the remaining Ottoman Empire to the point where it no longer, it basically just depleted them completely.
Right.
Um, Leading up to this siege happened May 18th, 1565 to September 11th, 1565. Now, Valette had spies all over northern Africa, where the Ottomans had already taken over Tripoli. He had his guys over there, and they're delivering him information where the Ottoman Empire is talking openly about how important it is to take Malta as a place of strategy so that it can enter Europe. The forts there, everything that's there, right? Before all of this happens, Valette and everyone there build these forts up, fortify them. They go through all of Malta, the entire island. They harvest all the crops. There's no food anywhere that they can eat. Then they throw dead animals in all of the wells that they could come across, and then they just fortify the forts. Saint Elmo, Saint Angelo, right? These were like their two biggest and baddest of the time. And then when the Ottomans enter, or they see the Ottoman ships basically on the horizon, These guys are ready. Ready. I mean, they've just loaded ammunition, tons and tons of food in there, and it takes the Ottomans. The Knights lose maybe about 2,000 people. The Ottomans lose like 6 to 8,000 people, right? Like in the first, you know, kind of battles, and the Ottomans lose so many of their important strategists and captains and things like that. They even lost their main general, um, who got basically hit by friendly fire. It's reported, and so it was left with a couple of their generals, a guy named Mustafa, and then another guy who were not really on the same page with one another about things. But they started getting really pissed because they're losing all of these men, and there's no like it's like, why is this tiny island so hard to take? So
Right.
Mustafa orders the captive knights that he has, the 9 captive knights, to be beheaded. And this is after they finally took over St. Elmo, which was this first fort, this like biggest fort that they had, which was a huge blow to the knights, to be honest. But they're at St. Elmo now, and he has 9 of these knights captive. He decapitates the knights. He ties their bodies up to crucifixes, and he just floats them over the bay to the other fort where the knights are. And Valette sees this. It infuriates him. So he orders a complete execution of all of the Ottoman prisoners that he has, and he cuts their heads off. He loads them into cannons and he fires them across the bay at St. Elmo.
Oh man, that's yeah.
Hood.
That's wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
It was a different
humans,
time,
man.
man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like this guy Mustafa and this guy Valette were sort of like these arch enemies in this entire thing.
Right. 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 I mean that. Wow, that island is just incredibly highly defensible.
Yeah.
Highly defensible island, or something. Like, what else could be going on there other than it being like highly defensible from the perspective of the walls that are built up on the edges or something, right?
Yes. And for you guys that want to see a little bit of that in our next episode, we're going to be talking about these structures a little bit more. Um, but yeah, so Valette, he's like 70-year-old dude, right? Something like that at
Right.
this point in his life. He's this is like is infuriating him so much that he himself is getting out on the battlefield and wiping out Ottomans in his 70s. Like, these guys were hardcore. Like, guys that had lost like the function of their legs are standing guard with a spear in places and just waiting for an Ottoman to come to kill them,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like, they're just like, whatever. Like, life's over. Let's just defend the fort.
Right.
And it works. Basically, in September, the Ottomans had been so overrun by sickness, by just the utter defeat of not being able to really make that many moves on Malta. Their morale just was becoming really, really low. And then finally, all of these fresh men come over from like Sicily, that's been ordered, from the Holy Roman Empire. They have like a few thousand troops now there that are fresh, and these guys are already retreating. They just go and wipe the rest of the retreating guys out. And, the Ottomans basically like ran home with their tail between their legs. What were they going to do?
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. I mean, wow. I don't even know what to say about that. That's an incredible story. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, Malta, this was not the first time Malta had to be defended or it got totally uh wasted. I mean, who knows what these megalithic sites would look like if Malta hadn't been so attacked for so many years, all of this time.
Right.
And did you know? Okay, so Napoleon wants to take over Malta. Napoleon's taken over everything, the Napoleon Empire, taken over everything. He wants to take over Malta. He has like the best and the brightest ships anywhere. Everybody is like totally in awe of the ships this guy has. He gets his ass handed to him by the
Right.
Brits,
Right.
right off of the coast of Malta,
Right.
right? Fast forward to World War II. For some reason, Hitler is obsessed with Malta. Now, if you talk to historians, they're like, well, at the time in the war, Hitler is starting to partner with the Italians, who have their own kind of agenda in all of this fascist agenda. They're kind of starting to partner with one another. Hitler is trying to strengthen his own troops, but it all comes down to Malta. Malta ends up being the most bombed place in all of World War II.
Yeah, can you imagine? I mean, this is a place the size of Rhode Island, and it's the most bombed place.
Dude, 1/10 the size of
One
Rhode Island.
tenth of the size. Sorry.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So you got to like wonder what's going on Malta. I mean, there are okay, so I understand, why Hitler wanted this from the perspective of strategy. Like everybody wants this
Everybody
island.
wants this. Yeah.
You can't go take over lands without taking this island, because if you have that island, you basically control the Mediterranean. That's it. But I do know that as the British were really trying to get supply ships to Malta, because Malta doesn't actually you can't subsist living on Malta with that type of a population and that type of infrastructure. So they had to bring supply ships, and most of the supply ships, they just wouldn't make it because the Nazis were just going crazy on the supply ships, and that's pretty much all they can do. So yeah, Malta was needed by Hitler, but it's
Yeah.
not just because of that.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll be getting into that soon.
Yeah.
A little bit more of a fun fact about World War II is in a very short period, Malta ended up being the downfall. You could argue this kind of the downfall of like the Nazis, because when they started really digging in their heels on getting Malta, Hitler must have lost something like 128 planes in a very, very short period of time. Like he's sacrificing all of these planes to obtain this tiny little island, both for strategy and what would seem like some type of metaphysical madness that he had. Not our type of metaphysical, but his
Metaphysical madness.
type.
I like that.
So it's real strange. And before we get into what Hitler was like really what he wanted there so badly, it wouldn't be right if we didn't talk just a little bit about the Knights of Malta, which is also its own huge story that we could probably do like a 3-part series on. I mean, we're talking about some of the like most conspiratorial stuff going on with a few of the grand masters of the Knights of Malta that had taken over. First of all, they get thrown out of their island years earlier by the Ottomans. It was the island of Rhodes. They find refuge on Malta. Charles V of Spain, one of the Habsburgs, gives them Malta with the condition that they just need to give him one Maltese falcon a year as a token of their appreciation. You can look into Maltese falcons if you like.
Her eyesight is so sharp, she can pick out prey more than a kilometer away.
Now, you kind of go back in time. Charles V was a part of this thing called the Order of the Golden Fleece, which had been created by a guy named Philip the Good, which was, about 100 years before him, probably. Give or take a few. The Order of the Golden Fleece, like all of these orders, they're all deeply entrenched in this like very early Christian lore, this search for the Holy Grail, this immortality, which drove the Knights of Malta. One of the main sort of slogans of the Knights of Malta is they reject death. And their Grand Master Pinto, who took charge for a period of time, was obsessed with alchemy. He brought in Count Cogliostro over there for a while. They were trying to find, the philosopher's stone. They're trying to create it. This is very, very deep stuff. All of this happening on the island of Malta, you guys. It's
I'm
wild.
keeping my mouth shut because I literally can't talk without going into the craziest stuff at this point.
Well, then why don't you just go into the crazy stuff, John? Let's hear it. I got to hear it now.
Well, okay, so there's a lot of things going on Malta, and I'm just going to start to peel back one layer with regard to Hitler, with regard to these older royals. I guess you can call them that. I wouldn't call them that, but a lot of people do.
Like the Habsburgs and,
right.
the inbred kings of our time.
Well, you know what's interesting, actually, the inbred kings. If you look at comparative mythology, and you look at a lot of these old stories coming from Japan, the Nordics, to Hinduism, to Egypt, etc., all across the planet, comparative mythology typically shows a brother and a sister who are gods, right? And in a lot of the stories, at some point in time, there are a brother and sister who come together, and they are an aspect of each other, and they have a child, right? So the
Right.
gods, right? But this is on more of a spiritual type level, spiritual, physical, where they don't have this inbred thing take place. But the royalties of old believe that they are part of that, and that here on Earth you would have, a child with your sister, because that's what the gods were doing in a sense. But it's more on this spiritual realm, right?
That's
So
freaky.
yeah, it is. It is freaky. So it's like a misinterpretation. It's a shadow world. It's a big shadow world of what they are trying to enact on this planet that doesn't actually work.
So you guys at home, if you're watching this, hold up a picture of the Habsburgs, who had ruled Europe for a really long time. I can't remember the exact time period here, but they were very obsessed with their bloodline and not mixing their bloodline with lesser bloodlines, I guess you could say. And they ended up um, acquiring really grotesque features that only occur when you have inbreeding involved. This was Charles V, the man that gave the island of Malta to the Knights of Malta. His jaw was, this was no lie here. Like, this isn't a bad painter. We're talking about, this thing that they had called the Habsburg jaw, which came from too much inbreeding, essentially. Some of them were drooling messes. They couldn't even rule a
Yeah.
kingdom. It got so bad.
Well, when we get to Malta, and what Hitler was obsessed with in Malta, obviously, you have the ancient history of it, that it is completely impenetrable from a certain perspective. And so he needed that, obviously, because he needed to control that area of the sea in order to take over North Africa, which he couldn't do, right? So there is something else, though. So earlier he had Himmler. Himmler was very obsessed. One of his, what was Himmler? He was SS, right?
He was the head of the SS, I think.
The head of the SS, right? So he was very obsessed with the Holy Grail,
Yes.
and looking for the Holy Grail, and literally following the trail of the Templars. Okay, so the Knights Templar, there was a huge thing going on in France. One of the big things that was going on in France with Himmler is the search for the Holy Grail, and trying to understand what that meant, whether that was related to what the actual bloodline of Christ or some physical object. Because a big portion of the SS on the theoretical research side was to try to connect the Aryan race to the main seat of power on this planet, right? To the Christ, to all of that stuff, right? Because they wanted to rule this planet. And so Malta falls into the whole Holy Grail situation, as well as other relics that the Templars, we know they were there, 1,000 years ago who are, well, they say that the Templars built a lot of the tunnels, but I don't believe that. But the Templars used that island, that location, because you got to think about this. Like, that island has repelled so many massive battles, navies, that
You're talking about
that
Malta right now, to be
yeah,
clear.
talking about Malta right now, right? So Malta as an island and who's in control of it has a huge foothold, so much so that nobody's going to be able to get on that island, right? Nobody's, for the most part, nobody's going to be able to get on that island if you play it right. And so you can hide whatever you want in there. So the Templars were hiding stuff there.
Okay, check this out. Because I have information that lines up exactly with what you're saying. After the Knights Templar were basically wiped out, I think that was 1280 something,
Yeah.
some date like this. They were kind of wandering for a while, and it is alleged that they merged with the Knights of Malta at some point, and
Yeah.
those funds basically merged right into the Knights of Malta, and they were using the tunnels underneath Malta to hide all of this good stuff.
To me, like from a remote viewing perspective, it's the same group. There's no difference to me at all between the Knights Malta, the Knights Templar. No difference. Same group. And this is what Hitler was after. I mean, that's another aspect of it. Like that, because these warrens are throughout the whole island, even places that people don't know about now, right? I mean, more so, like they don't know what's down there. And so relics that the Templars, the Knights of Malta hid as well, are probably still there if the British haven't found them.
Multiple articles, including the National Geographic article that published in 1940, talk about the fact that the entire tunnel system underneath Malta connected everything on the island, and that the British shut that down at some point.
Right. They started burying it. Yeah. They probably found what they wanted to find.
Or or
Trying to keep something out,
or they
perhaps.
were or perhaps they were trying to keep something in the tunnel,
Sorry, yeah.
which is probably a perfect place for us to cut this episode off at. I'm actually quite shocked. This is our first episode in many episodes that we're about to have on the island history, temples, megalithic sites of Malta. We've just scratched the surface, and this was already an extremely intense conversation about what's happening over there. Now, just so that you guys know, the story of Hitler does not end here. Hitler was also obsessed with Mount Vesuvius. It was reported in articles that were peer reviewed that the Americans were bombing Vesuvius to basically bomb the Nazis out of Vesuvius. And you and I have talked about this in previous episodes, that the tunnels of Baiae that were underneath Vesuvius is reportedly where the old river Styx was. Hitler was also obsessed with this area, and they're all a tunnel system. This is very strange that it's making me think that when in the old days, they talked about Hades being the god of the underworld, they were not talking about hell. They might have actually been talking about the inner earth, in the way that Poseidon was the god of the sea and the ocean. Who knows what's going on under there? Maybe there's something to this. What do you think?
There is. There is something to this. And I don't know if we want to get into it now or later, but there is something to this, which is another aspect of that island.
We will get into this another time. For those of you at home watching, hope you enjoyed this episode. Please let us know what you think in the comments below. We love you guys. Thanks so much for watching. John, thank you for being with us. And we hope you guys thought this episode was as out of this world as we did.